Joining us today for the Presidency, Politics, and Pay-per-Click Digital and Traditional Media Impact Plenary Session here at the NALEO Conference. My name is State Representative Cesar Blanco from El Paso, Texas, and it's great to be here today. So the evolution of media and its impact on American politics really came to the forefront in the election cycle of 2016 in a way that our country has never really seen before. With the 24-hour news cycle and the social media turning and breaking headlines into viral stories that voters were constantly inundated, whether they had facts or unfact-checked information and highly partisan content in the lead up to the election day. This plenary brings together leading experts to discuss how this phenomenon might have influenced the outcome of the election in 2016, and whether it will shape American politics, public faith in the integrity and in the integrity of the press and our nation's political system in the years to come. And today we're joined by a great group of talented professionals in media and press who are at the forefront of national politics. Today we're joined with Mr. Tucker Doherty, who is the data reporter for Politico. He's a graduate of Cornell University and has garnered extensive experience in our nation's capital, having previously worked for both the National Journal, The Atlantic, before joining Politico as a data reporter. Most recently, he co-authored The Media Bubble is Worse Than You Think, where he crunched the numbers and took an in-depth look at the rapid changes taking place within the media industry and the potential impacts that this could have on reporting moving forward. We're also joined by Mr. Juan Carlos Lopez, who is the chief correspondent at CNN en Español. He's referred to the Wolf Blitzer of CNN en Español, and the beard is really coming out very nicely, by the way. He is an Emmy-nominated journalist with an accomplished and distinguished career that spans multiple decades. In 1993, Carlos Lopez began working for CNN, moving over to the Spanish network when CNN created CNN en Español. He has interviewed 3 sitting presidents and covered some of the biggest moments in our nation's history while at the network, including Elian Gonzalez controversy, the 9/11 attacks, and the 2000 election. Most recently, Mr. Lopez was one of 3 network journalists chosen to moderate the CNN presidential debate. We're also joined by Mr. Ed O'Keefe, political reporter at the Washington Post. Now, don't let the O'Keefe distract you. He's actually from Guatemala, so we have a Chapin in the house. He's a native of Albany, New York, and he joined the staff of the Washington Post in 2005, where he currently serves as the congressional reporter. He has covered numerous congressional and presidential elections over the course of his accomplished career, including the 2008, 2012, and 2016 elections. Mr. O'Keefe serves as an on-air contributor for CBS News' Face the Nation, and he's a frequent guest of radio and television programs on BBC, Fox News Channel, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and SiriusXM. We're also joined by Janet Rodriguez, White House correspondent for Univision. She's the current White House correspondent for Univision and is a multi-Emmy award-winning journalist who hails from Miami, Florida. Prior to moving to DC, she reported from Phoenix, where she won a regional Emmy for the story on undocumented immigrants living in tent cities. She also went on to win 3 more regional Emmys in the Grand Canyon State for her reporting on law enforcement and immigration, including a story about a prison hunger strike where she was the only journalist to get inside and actually interview the inmates. We have a very talented panel, and I'm very excited because this is a unique experience for a politician to ask the tough questions to the media. So we're looking forward to a great panel today. Let's give our panelists a wonderful, warm welcome.
And you got us comfortable chairs, too.
We did. So we want to start a little bit with Tucker. You've done a considerable amount of research in the evolution of the media industry. What are some of the biggest challenges and changes that you've seen in recent years in that area of study?
So after the inauguration, I wanted to pitch to the folks at Politico magazine looking at this idea of a media bubble, because it's something that's really percolated, this idea that the media is increasingly sheltered or cut off or doesn't have its finger on the pulse of the country. And we wanted to bring hard data into the question. So what we looked at primarily was jobs data and the geography of it. Where are media jobs, and has that changed? And the answer is that it has, and there's been sort of two big trends that jumped out at us that a lot of people might be sort of vaguely familiar with. The first is that newspaper jobs, totally in collapse for the last 10 years. They used to be the largest category of media jobs, but now they've lost about half of the jobs in newspapers just in the last 10 years. And the thing about newspaper jobs is that they're really well spread out across the country. They're in big cities, but they're also in small cities, small towns, rural areas. So when you have such a collapse of that part of the industry, you lose a lot of the jobs in these areas in media. The flip side is that there's a new booming industry of online media. BuzzFeed might be the stereotypical example. And when you look at where those jobs are, which have sort of replaced these newspaper jobs one-to-one, these new online media jobs are all in just a handful of big cities. You know, the downtowns of New York, San Francisco, LA, Seattle. And so the net result of those two trends is that there's been this huge migration of media jobs sort of from the outskirts of the country to the downtowns. And when you look at the 2016 election results, it was those downtowns where Hillary Clinton did really well in both the primary and the general election. So in the article, we ended up speculating that, well, the fact that the media has become so much more clustered in these sort of more affluent, more educated, gentrifying downtown cities means that there really has been increasingly, you might call it a bubble, you could call it a blind spot, and it's really, I think, changed the general tenor of the media ecosystem.
So what exactly is the media bubble, and why is it important?
So, you know, the media has always been unrepresentative of the country in a lot of ways. You know, for decades, it's been less diverse than the country as a whole, and increasingly so. There's a gender imbalance. Only about 1/3 of journalists are women, when obviously half of the country is. But this idea of the bubble, you know, a lot of people might call it the liberal media bubble, although I don't think that's the only way to look at it. It's just the idea that if your reporting reflects where you're from and where you work and where you report every day, and if all of these jobs are moving to these downtown cities, basically, if there's something, you know, political, cultural, social happening in rural areas and small towns, it's harder to pick it up. So, you know, a big publication like Politico or the Washington Post, you know, they'll try as hard as they can. They'll fly out reporters to Iowa or Wisconsin. They'll spend, you know, a week or two there, and they'll really, you know, do their best to do a good job and capture, but it's not really the same as, you know, being a journalist, say, living in those areas full time. And so we think that this loss of this broader newspaper media ecosystem is partially to blame for the idea that the media didn't, you know, get the Trump phenomenon or didn't see it coming.
Right. Do you think that the bubble may have influenced the media perception and reporting in the lead up to the presidential election?
I definitely think so. You got a sense when reading some articles about, you know, the stereotypical Trump voter. It was almost like a foreign correspondent going out to some of these areas where you can talk in generalities, you can read a popular book like Hillbilly Elegy and sort of strike a pose that you get the country as a whole. But I think when a lot of conservatives, a lot of Trump voters, and a lot of people disengage from politics altogether, when they say they feel increasingly disconnected from the media or the idea that it doesn't reflect their own experiences, there might be something real to that. So just a specific example, Donald Trump had this slogan, "Make America Great Again." And Hillary Clinton tried to counter with this slogan, "America is already great." And to do that, she cited economic statistics showing that the nation as a whole is growing and that jobs are doing well and that wages are starting to rise. But if you break down those economic numbers, it turns out where a lot of the growth is happening is these downtown cities. And if you look at rural areas and small towns, a lot of them are just completely falling apart. So if you're a member of the media and you're trying to adjudicate between these two slogans, you might look at the overall picture and say, there's something to that idea that America is already great. But if you are a voter in a struggling, rural town in northern Michigan, that just might seem like the media is on another planet from you, because it's not what you see day to day.
Juan Carlos, you've had an accomplished career for decades covering historic moments in national politics, as well as numerous congressional races and presidential elections. Given your extensive experiences in the media and in the industry, would you describe the 2016 election as a unique one compared to all the others that you've covered? And how so?
Buenos dias. It's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation to Naleo and Dallas for its hospitality. I think we are. I mean, this week I feel like we're in the Groundhog Day movie, where you have an election where there was a perceived result that didn't happen, where we have a bill that is being rolled out with no knowledge from the parties. I don't see, we're not in politics as usual. I think this whole election, the whole dynamic changed, and it's changing the way we see politics, the way we cover them. And this whole debate of did we miss or didn't we miss? And I think Tucker's making some very, very interesting points about that bubble and the perception we have. So will this be sustainable? Will this be the future? Is there another Donald Trump? Or is the Donald Trump factor? I think those are questions that we're just starting to see and that we're just starting to answer. And it's ironic that we see the president, he claims that he's done more than any president at this stage in his presidency. And when you look at it, he might have said he's done a lot of things, but the legislative agenda isn't moving. So not very different from obstruction when one party is in the opposition. I think we're at the same spot. We're just with different actors, and we'll see what long-term effect it has, but it is completely different from what I've seen before.
You were only one of 3 CNN presidential debate moderators in the last year, and the only Latino. Why do you think it's important that Latino members of the media be included in future debates?
The exposure. I think the exposure is important. I think the input that we bring. And I think it's a reflection of the country, of the professionals that work in media, regardless of their background, of what they could bring along. But also, I think it's important for people at home, for voters. We've been talking so long about how Latinos have to get involved, about the potential, about the difference we can make. And we just went through an election where Republicans and Donald Trump proved that they can win regardless of the Latino vote. So I think our presence in all stages, our presence at all levels, just shows what we're able of doing and capable of doing and bringing our insight. I think we need more of it, and I hope that we get more of it coming to the future.
A question regarding CNN. It's been frequently attacked and criticized. How has the network worked to combat some of these criticisms? And what do you think that these attacks have they a negative effect on CNN's reputation, not only among Latinos, but in general?
I mean, when we hear the attacks, my personal reaction is bring it on. We're ready, we're strong, that's our job. We have to be able to do it. We have to be able to defend our reporting. Will we make mistakes? Yes, we do. Everyone does. I don't think there's an outlet out there that hasn't made mistakes, but have they been deliberate, intentional? No. We strive to provide thorough, accurate coverage. We have the resources to do it. And I think if we look at the moment we're living and we compare it to other countries, even in the region, we talk about the risk and the perils of democracy. But I think one of the big takeaways from these 6 months have been the strength of our institutions. And we have a very strong judicial system, and we have independent courts, and we have a very strong media. And that's, this is the reaction. So I think for CNN, it's been important, it's been positive, it's been helpful. As you see, the company is doing very well. And we just have to strive to keep on bringing good reporting, solid reporting, and to be able to be up to the challenge. And the attacks just make us stronger. I made the comparison, and I apologize if anyone is offended by bullfighting, but in bullfighting, the more you attack the bull, the more you pinch the bull, the angrier it gets and the more it reacts. So I think that's what happens to the media, and I think that's a big factor here. We are doing our job because we think this is the right thing to do. We do not have, I know that Ed, I know that we don't have a personal agenda. This isn't something, and ego might play into it, but we just want to do our job. We want to tell the story, and we want reporting to be accurate. So if you come and attack us, we're going to keep on doing it. We're not going to go back. We're not Venezuela. We're not other countries in the region where media has been sidelined. That's not going to happen here. It hasn't happened, and it won't happen.
It's a great transition to a topic that I want to ask Ed. Yeah, you're a veteran political journalist who's covered news related to Congress, the executive branch, throughout your career as a reporter in our nation's capital. How's the spread of fake news impacted the newsroom, and has fake news directly impacted your reporting?
Well, first off, we should stop referring to Juan Carlos Lopez as the Latino Wolf Blitzer. We should start referring to Wolf Blitzer as the gringo Juan Carlos Lopez. Let's remember that, because he's been around just as long. And following up on what he said, I will share with you what my boss, Marty Barron, the executive editor of the Post, says in response to the question about attacks on the media or on our work. And I think it's important for everyone to remember that, at least at the Post, what he says is we are not at war with the administration. We are merely doing our jobs. And we would be doing the same amount of aggressive work were Hillary Clinton the president. Perhaps the only big difference, and this is part of what I think the president struggles with, is while we had decades worth of reporting on the Clinton family and the Clinton background and all of the work that she had done and her husband had done because he was also president, Trump's background and story was more fodder for tabloids or his own books than for serious investigative journalism. Now that he is a public official, questions and investigations and research into him and his family's business is justified by virtue of him being president, and the fact that he may, in some cases, be violating certain constitutional issues or other federal laws. But frankly, also, I think the entire experience has been a good reminder to the country of certain constitutional limits, that in some cases, federal law and federal ethics rules do not actually apply to the president, no matter who that president is. And that's been part of the learning experience, I think, for a lot of people. Fake news is a dangerous phenomenon, but it's an outgrowth of the First Amendment, and everyone on this stage benefits from, frankly, profits from, and is able to do the work we do because of the First Amendment. So you have to be careful in not allowing there to be public and free discourse, but you have to also, I think, be mindful of what it is you're reading. And my argument always when it comes to fake news is we're not doing fake news at the Washington Post, Univision, CNN, or Politico. It is incumbent on you, the reader, the consumer, or the viewer, to not be as passive necessarily in how you're consuming the news. and sit there with a slightly critical eye. Double check, wait, is this a story that was written today or this week? Or is this something from 3 years ago that for some reason is just cycling through my Facebook feed because somebody put it there and it started churning and showing up? And who's the author of this? You know, what is the source? Is it something reputable? Is it something I've read before? Is this somebody who appears to actually have a history of writing about this subject? You'll notice we've made some very subtle changes. You ask about the effect of fake news in our newsroom. We have proactively taken steps to be a little more transparent, but also to help clarify for you as you become a better and more discerning news consumer, to point out, in some cases, if it's a columnist, for example, you may see a little more clearly now, opinion over the top of the headline or right by the start of the text, or even in the tweets. You know, it'll say opinion colon and then the headline. Or analysis, which is not necessarily, of course, opinion. It's more contextual, and we've put that, you know, analysis colon, then the headline, to help you understand that this is considered to be more analytical or opinionated versus regular news. And you know, that was based on feedback from readers and advertisers. It was based on our own feeling that it was something we should help do to help clarify for people and demonstrate that it is not fake. It is either opinion, studied opinion, or it is fact-based news. Where I think it's having an effect on reporters generally is it just sort of motivates us to ensure that our work is as fair and as accurate and as thorough as it can be, because that is our best defense against accusations that it is incorrect or fake or unfair. Back everything up you write with basic facts, so that if they come at you, you can show them, here are the facts. You can't dispute them. I get that people are upset that we cover things certain ways, and they may claim that we're being harder on this president than those in the past, but I guarantee you that Barack Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton were just as upset at the Washington Post as Donald Trump is. Maybe he's a little more public and vocal about it, but we never had a sit-down. We had one sit-down interview with Barack Obama over the 8 years he was president. We've already had 3 or 4, I think, since Donald Trump became president. So for all the criticism he gives to the Post, or to, I know CNN's situation's a little different, I know Univision's situation's a little different, we've talked to the guy more than we talked to Barack Obama. And you decide how our coverage of either of those guys has been, that should tell you something. And so all I say to the issue of fake news is, we're gonna do our job, we're gonna keep our head down and keep doing what we do. You, as the news consumer, need to be a little more discerning and cautious about it and make the decision on your own. Is this something I want to trust, or is this something I want to go verify? And really sort of help, I think, either push that stuff out of the ecosystem, or at least be able to understand that this is someone's opinion of something that is not based in reality, and this is actually serious journalism.
So the industry has evolved quite a bit. I'm a fan of reading the actual physical book or the newspaper in front of you, but it's evolved. We've really gone into online publishing, and social media has really become a news source where people get their news. As a print journalist, how have you diversified your mediums in which you report your news?
First of all, I'm not a print journalist. I've never considered myself a print journalist. And nobody in this business should consider themselves any kind of medium anymore. You're a journalist, period. Your work appears, well, your work appears on the air, but I guarantee you that there are millions of people who watch Juan Carlos or Janet's work on their phone through Twitter, all right? That's not watching at 6 p.m. Eastern or 6:30 Eastern. That's just not the way it's done anymore. By the same token, I know that most of the people who read my work are reading it on their iPad or their phone or on their computer. They're not reading it in the paper anymore. So we don't consider ourselves print journalists anymore. We are journalists. That's the big change. For those of you that may not realize, you know, our owner is Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. I like to remind people, you know, if you have an Amazon Prime account, you can get a discounted subscription to the Washington Post as well. Just saying. And who knows, soon you may be able to buy us at Whole Foods, because he's buying Whole Foods too. But, you know, I started at the Post at a point where we were becoming more digital anyway, so I've never considered myself an ink-stained wretch or anything like that. I doubt you would either. I mean, because Politico, frankly, is one of the organizations that drove all of us that were in traditional legacy print media to intensify the shift to online first, or just sort of being platform agnostic, as we say. So that's the big thing. You shouldn't call us a print journalism organization. I don't consider myself one. My understanding is my deadline was 5 minutes ago, and it may end up in the paper tomorrow. But if it doesn't end up in the paper, it still lives online, and more people may see it there anyway.
Mm-hmm. Janet, you're an Emmy Award-winning journalist who has had extensive experience covering critical issues that face the Latino community, including reporting on SB 1070 in Arizona while working in Phoenix. Have you seen a difference in the way that the media covers the Latino community and the electorate in recent years?
What I have seen is a difference in the way this election season was covered when it comes to Latino issues. I think mainstream, obviously, the way we, CNN en Español and Univision, Telemundo cover Latino issues is not the way mainstream media, the Washington Post, Politico, covers those issues. They think, to an extent, as immigration is the only Latino issue, where we know that's not true. We have many issues, the economy and jobs and education, top immigration in many surveys when it comes to Latino issues in our communities. Therefore, we're covering all of that, whereas mainstream media may not get there, may not include Latinos in those conversations when it comes to jobs, to education, to healthcare. Now that there is a big discussion on healthcare going on in Congress at the moment, we don't see a lot of Latino faces being put forward as part of the conversation. But when I was on the campaign trail, I was embedded with Ted Cruz for a little while. We went from New Hampshire all the way to Super Tuesday here in Texas, covering the campaign day to day. And my biggest takeaway from that was the way he was not only covering the Latino population, but the way the Latino population was looking at him. And there was a lot of fear coming from his campaign to talk to us, to address the issue. Even though at the rallies he was very much in line with what Donald Trump was saying, and those issues were on the forefront of the way he was selling himself to the nation, he never granted us an interview. I was with Telemundo at the time, I should say. But he never sat down with us because in their minds, all we wanted to talk about was the border, was immigration, was what are you going to do with illegal immigrants? And yes, that's true, but we also wanted to know a lot of other things that they didn't care to address and that they didn't care to bring up. But every time we went to a rally, it did not matter where it was, in middle of America, anywhere, there were Latinos in the audience. And in a lot of places, they did not feel that they were represented enough in the way these candidates were talking to them. And I'm not sure that mainstream media picked up on a lot of that where we were. We were reporting on how these Latinos that are Republican, that are going to these rallies, are not being spoken to necessarily. And I felt that we in Spanish media became a part of the story as well. And the way we were covering the elections became a huge part of the story, to the point where after the elections, after it was all said and done, in the first briefing at the White House, I was called on third that day after two other conservative medias were called. And Fox News wrote a whole article about me. Why was I called on third before Fox News? If Univision spent a whole campaign not necessarily being nice to Donald Trump. Many on the right side perceived us as taking a stance and perceived us as us being on the other side. And why was Univision being granted a question in the briefing? And that became a whole issue where, why not? We have a set of issues that we want to address. We have an audience that's growing and that feel that what we have to give them is more so than any other medium. I think people come to us because they depend on us, more so than maybe on the Washington Post or Politico, we're the only source of information. So we have a responsibility to get that to them, and I feel that they don't necessarily understand how we cover a lot of things, and they feel that we are an immigration-only issue where obviously that's not the case.
So you've had the opportunity to work for both Univision and Telemundo. How do you, what are your thoughts on the difference between how English media presents the news and Spanish media presents the news?
Well, I think we have an advantage that we get our audience. Many of us are immigrants. If you work in Spanish media, you've probably lived a lot of the stories that you're reporting on, so we have that advantage for us. There's very few Hispanic reporters in English media, and that's just a fact of life. And if you're sending, no offense, but a gringo reporter to cover immigration issues SB 1070, he may not be doing not as good of a job, but as relatable as a job as Ed O'Keefe may be able to do, because he's had the experience. He comes from the background. He can maybe talk to you in Spanish. Just the fact that I can talk to you in Spanish, whereas somebody may not be able to on the other side, that just makes a huge difference. So just understanding the issue, not just on a factual basis, but on an emotional basis, I think it makes a huge difference.
It's clearly a very, you all play a very unique role. As a White House correspondent, what has been your experience covering the Trump administration? And do you think that the priorities of Latinos are being addressed with the Trump administration?
Yes and no. I feel that there needs to be a lot more understanding. We go back to the issues, and I'll tell you what, I've been called on a few times in the briefing room, but I know that if there is an issue or immigration story that's on the news that day, or something that happened that may not look good upon the administration, or that the administration doesn't want to address that day, they won't call on me. And that's just a fact of life. But this time around, they're trying to do something different. They don't have a Hispanic media liaison per se. They did away with the Hispanic office at the White House for media. They have strategic media, and we fall under that. And in many cases, they're not addressing Hispanic issues from the podium. Sean Spicer, or whoever that day may be, they decide to leave it to those people who are in charge of strategic media, where we fall under. And well, that's great, because I still get my Spanish interview, and I still get to have a spokesperson from the administration to come forth and explain whatever it is that may be going on. There is no reason why you can't get in that podium and address a Hispanic issue to the whole nation. And that's just unacceptable in many levels. We've asked about Cuba, we've asked about Venezuela, we've asked about DAPA, obviously, and many times we're just referred to the State Department, the DHS. Why can't you have a message that's forthcoming, that addresses your point of view, and just sell it like you would healthcare, or sell it like you would tax issues? We are as important, and our immigration issues, or whatever it may be, is as important as anything else. Venezuela, for example, Sean Spicer has not addressed Venezuela when it comes to questions in the briefing room, and that tells you a lot about how much maybe unprepared or unwilling they are to talk about what matters to the Hispanic community.
So we saw Trump as a candidate kick Jorge Ramos out of an interview. I want to go back to Ed's comment about the accessibility by this administration versus the Obama administration. How does that play with Latino media? Is it the same type of accessibility as
Yes,
Washington?
Accessibility has not been an issue. Unlike many people, well, we have not gotten the president, we have not gotten the vice president, yet we have been given access, and we have to be fair to this administration. They have put us in rooms where we hadn't been before. Univision is not part of the pool, what we call, yet they have made some efforts to make us part of the pools when it matters. So we're there for the Cinco de Mayo celebration. So we're there when a president from a Hispanic country comes to the White House. We're part of the pool for the day. So they have made some efforts to get us access. And they do have Spanish-speaking people that come on camera, and they don't shy away from the tough questions. That has happened. Yet, there's still a divide, and they don't see us as mainstream media, which is a problem.
Right, so I want to go back to, you said when it matters, and I guess when it matters to the administration, and you said that there's a challenge where Latinos are pigeonholed into immigration or border security and issues like that. We're having a national debate on healthcare, which is very important for Latinos in this country. If the administration decides when Univision is in that press pool, doesn't that affect the information that Latinos receive that are primarily Spanish-speaking on issues that are important to them and affect them day to day?
Oh, what the administration decides doesn't dictate what we put on air. So that's very important. So the administration may grant us access to a Cinco de Mayo party, doesn't mean we're gonna do a story on it. We end up deciding what issues matter to our audiences and whether we get the help or not of the administration. That's what goes on air in terms of we have the final say. And I'm covering, the war when we threw the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. I had a question on that day, but logically, the White House is not going to think that we're going to do a story on that where we are. We cover the Russia issue mostly, twice or 3 times a week. We're covering anything and everything that you could think of because for our perspective, our audience wants to be informed, period. And that means on any number of topics. And whether they grant us access or not on that topic, we will inform and we will do our jobs as thorough as anybody else.
So I want to transition a little into a general question. And I think it's an important question that we ask ourselves, and I know this audience is very much engaged. What the heck happened in the election of 2016? And how did the polling get things so wrong?
So when I tell people that my title is data reporter, this is probably the thing they ask me 20 seconds later is, what the heck happened with the polls? Why were the polls so wrong? Why was I so surprised on election night? And the first answer I give usually produces some groans, and that is that the polls were not wrong. The national polls run by the big networks, they said that Hillary Clinton was going to win the national popular vote by about 2%, and she did. We all learned in November that winning the popular vote by 2% does not mean what we thought it meant.
We learned it again.
Yes.
But there were real issues with the state polls, and I think that's where the Electoral College story sort of slipped under the noses of a lot of the media. And I think we're still in a process of sort of an autopsy of the state polls, but the biggest thing that's jumped out so far is state polls are often run by smaller organizations, local colleges. They don't have a huge budget. It's also just methodologically challenging to do a state poll compared to a national poll. We're a lot better at national polls. And after race, the biggest divide in terms of the numbers this year with the election was education. Whether or not you had a college degree was one of the biggest factors for whether you voted for Hillary Clinton, if you had one, or if you didn't, you were more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And about half of state polls made no effort whatsoever to control for education. And it turns out that when you call people up on the phone or you send them some mail, people with a college degree are a lot more eager to talk to a pollster. They're a lot more willing. It's not necessarily that they're more proud of their political views or something, but they tend to be more connected. They tend to be more plugged in. And so a lot of these state polls, when you sort of dig into the guts of them after the fact, they were assuming way too many voters with college degrees in these states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. And so what Democrats thought was sort of this safe firewall in the Northeast, it really wasn't. And it's likely that if you could somehow go back in time and fix all of these state polls, you would have seen Donald Trump doing really well in these states all along. And I think the issue with these polls is partly a separate issue than this idea of the media bubble I was talking about. But on the other hand, if we did have the same news ecosystem that we had 10 to 20 years ago, if we had newspapers in all of these areas, if 30 years ago, it wasn't universal for reporters really to have college degrees. It was a lot more common for reporters to not have a college degree. Maybe people would have sensed that there was something amiss, that there was some disconnect between, you go to these areas of northern Michigan where it's Trump country, you see the bumper stickers, the signs, people painting their barns with Trump, versus the polls that were saying, oh, Hillary has Michigan in the bag. So I think that's the connection between the issues, but if in terms of what went wrong with the polls, it was state polls and it was missing education.
And they missed a few other things. You talk to people in Nevada especially, they've been furious for years at the way polling is done in Nevada for two reasons. One, if you don't have somebody who puede hablar español with the person answering the phone, they're going to hang up, which means you're going to automatically get an underrepresentation of Latino voters in that state. Secondly, there's still the issue of landline versus cell phone calling. Very few people have who has a landline here anymore? Okay, 1, 2 hands went up. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, there's hundreds of us in the room. So some of the methodology in the way polling is literally conducted has to be rethought, especially when it comes to language now in some of these biggest battleground states. And somebody, maybe it was you, Juan Carlos, who said earlier that Latinos didn't have necessarily the same effect on this past election as you think. I would urge to get Trump elected. I would argue it did because he got a higher percentage than expected, especially in Florida, which then helped him win Florida. He won a higher percentage of the Cuban-American vote in South Florida, but also through Central Florida. And there may have been some inability to capture that support in polling. Maybe that just required better reporting of us on the ground to go and talk to these people. But maybe also something was not getting picked up there, again, because of the linguistic and other limitations on the way that this stuff is done.
And I think the media bubble played a big role in the way we cover the elections and the way those polls were not reported necessarily correctly. Because yes, you have a group of people who are embedded with these campaigns who are reporting, but you have a lot of reporters from Washington covering the elections that never got out there and never saw the reality on the grounds, never saw these Latinos that I saw in South Carolina in every single rally supporting whether it was Donald Trump or Ted Cruz and being on the other side. And we were able to put some of that on the air, but if the national media is not doing it as a whole, then a lot of that got lost. And the question was like, well, how did that happen? Well, they were there all along. We just didn't go find them.
I remember, it was one of the debates, I think, in Kentucky. And this, I don't remember what university it was, because they all seem now the same to me. But I remember meeting this young man. He was at a restaurant. He had just left the Army. He was back home. He had a DUI, so he couldn't drive. And the only job available in that town was in Walmart. And he had to take a bike for like an hour and a half to get to Walmart. And he was very frustrated, and he was thinking of moving to Florida. He had been based in Texas, and he missed that. And thinking of him when you were talking about that media bubble, I could understand how he would feel frustrated and feel tempted by the message of Make America Great Again. I just saw today a friend tweeted a picture of a campaign button from Reagan and Bush, which had the slogan, Make America Great Again, which was also used by Buchanan. It isn't new, but I think that media bubble does have an effect. This is something we were talking about with Janet. Like, when I leave the office, sometimes I'll drive, and I see that people are going on with their lives, and we're obsessed with the latest story, and sometimes we're even overwhelmed with so many stories that come out in such a rapid succession that you don't have time to just absorb these stories, report them when you move on to the next one. And I think that also, we live in the world of the media where we assume that these are the stories that people want to hear, and people maybe want to hear these stories, but want to hear others and want to hear talk about other things. And I do think that we were promised, I remember I have it in my office, the Time magazines that says Latinos will elect the next president. And yes, Trump did very well in Florida more. There's been a debate on the exit polls or not. But Latinos haven't been read well. And one of the messages I think Naleo has been very strong at and very effective is just getting people to understand how important it is to participate, to get involved. And this is something I do. It's a challenge I've had with friends, with my family, with people I meet on the road when we're doing the campaigns, is members of Congress work for you. If you ask them for something, they'll do it for you, but you have to get involved. Don't be afraid to ask. And I think that's part of the disconnect. If we are able to have that conversation and we're able to hear and understand what the real challenges are, I want to finish with a point that I read today, which I thought was fascinating. Barclays came out with a report. We have an oil glut, and gasoline is at the lowest price it's been in years. And one of the factors they believe that might be bringing the price of gasoline down in the US, right now, gasoline is going to be cheaper in the summer than it was in the winter, which is not normal. And they believe it's because the undocumented are afraid to drive, and they're driving less. And it's having an impact in the price we pay for gasoline nationwide. So these are the stories that should be covered.
Isn't that incredible? That's incredible that would be the reason. Yeah.
Well, there's those who say that, no, that statistically is insignificant, but they have seen a pattern.
I would think.
And the signal is going to come, they believe it'll come back to normal, but the fear that people are feeling is having an impact on the economy.
Yeah. You know, one other thing I think we as Latinos forget, and more broadly, we're here in Texas, and Cesar, I know this is probably harder for you to swallow and appreciate, but you know, we did have, for the first time, a Latino politician win presidential caucuses and primaries. No Democrat had ever done that. But Ted Cruz, whether you like it or not, will always be now, in history, that guy who did that first. And that was not lost on me. And I would remind my colleagues, I say, you know, when he won, I said, we have to say, the first Latino presidential candidate to win the Iowa caucus, the first Latino to win other primaries. And that was a very significant thing that I think was often lost on colleagues because they would say, well, he doesn't tout his Cuban heritage. It doesn't matter. He was, or he is, you know, a Latino politician. And let's also remember that right now in Washington, literally right now, they are toiling over the details of a new health care bill. Mitch McConnell wrote it, but there's one guy who had a lot of influence on the process on behalf of conservatives. Again, maybe not to the benefit of the broader Latino community, but Ted Cruz played a big role in telling Mitch McConnell what should end up in this bill, because he was the voice box for conservative lawmakers in Congress. And those of you in Texas here will either appreciate that or do something about it. But that is a fact, that among the very few people that Mitch McConnell consulted, one of them was the Latino senator from Texas. So, you know, part of this is calling out the history of certain things that are happening, even if someone doesn't necessarily embrace it the way that the media and the community traditionally thinks somebody should. But throughout that campaign, it was never lost on me that there were two Latino candidates who went pretty far and stood up to him. There was a third who had raised Latino American children in this country, who were bilingual, who had a Mexican American wife, who has a Mexican American wife, and that all of this was happening in the Republican Party and not in the Democratic Party. Sorry.
That's the reality of it, yeah.
You know, we've mentioned some of the challenges, the media bubble, resources to get people on the ground, to get real stories and real experiences, the challenges with polling. As an industry, what do you all do to ensure, what changes do you make? What adjustments do you make to make sure that you get 2018 accurate to get it right?
We're here in Dallas.
Yeah.
I mean, all four of us work in Washington, and I'm spending an extra day or two actually doing a story out here reporting on it, because people said, well, you got to get out in the country more. Well, I'm going to spend the next 2 days getting out in the country, and yes, only flying in and then flying back and maybe misreading things a little bit, but either way, taking the time to be out here. The other thing we've done at the Post is, yes, we don't have bureaus in Dallas or Chicago or Atlanta or Los Angeles, but we have developed now what's called the Washington Post Talent Network, which is almost like an Uber for journalists. We have freelancers across the country who have registered to be part of this. They pass sort of through a system to ensure that they're worthy of it, who are pitching us stories from the country on all sorts of issues. And then similarly, if something happens, we have a team of reliable people we can call upon to handle that story for us, while we maybe rush one of our own as well to join them in the field. So that was something that was done as a result of the fact that we had to close our bureaus, but we wanted to maintain a presence. And it is a formal but less structured one than we've had in the past. But it's also a little more organic because now people are flagging things for us and saying, we should write about this and we should get it out there. And they are subject matter and geographic experts across the country. That's one way we've looked at it.
And at Univision, we've grown our digital efforts by leaps and bounds. We have a digital team of over 100 people that are spread out throughout the country. I mean, you think of Univision, you may just think of Jorge Ramos and the national newscast and Edición Nocturna, but we have strengthened our digital team to be our forefront in many ways, and we have them throughout the countries in the smaller communities that I was talking about that we don't necessarily get to because of resources or TV, or there's just not the time. And these people are really doing a lot of the legwork for us to be out there and to tell the smaller stories that don't get told on TV, yet they get amazing viewership. So that's an effort that we have ongoing. The New York Times wrote an article on that a couple of days ago, and we are really taking on that very strongly.
There's I think the challenge, not only for us as media, but I think also for groups that advocate for Latinos, is how do you get to this very diverse group? Because a lot of people in this room, you know it all, there's not one Latino community. We're not one Latino group. We're many groups. We have many different points of view. And as we saw, Latinos helped Trump win Florida. And I think the challenge is how do you combine different strategies, both politically and from the media from a media standpoint, to cover it well. Because if you saw the numbers that Naleo had and the figures of people voting, I remember the goal was 13, 14 million voters, which was met. But still, you had a potential 28 million voters. So the goal, which was, there was a lot of work put into it, but we were going for 50%. So how do we make that higher? How do we reach the younger Latinos? And I know it from my personal experience, where you have the older generation that speaks Spanish, the people in the middle speak both, the younger ones only speak English, but relate through Spanish language media to their abuelitas or abuelitos or their uncles. And I think that's where the Holy Grail is. How do you get to them? And I remember telling the people at the Clinton campaign that I thought they were missing out because their whole thing was to make a big pitch to the millennials and to get the millennials to vote. And we saw the numbers, and that didn't happen. So how do you get to them? Because they're still Latinos. They might not speak Spanish, or they might not feel comfortable speaking it publicly, but how do you get to them? How do you get them involved? How do you get them to understand the civic responsibility they have to themselves, to their community, and public officials? How do you do it? How do you relate to them? I think that's where the Holy Grail is, where right now I believe nobody has the answer on how to do it, because we could do it from Spanish language media, but I know these millennials feel more integrated to the Washington Post, to this type of digital media, to Politico. But how do you talk to them? And how do you get them to come out and vote and really make a difference? Because until these votes and until these voters contribute to the campaigns like other interest groups in the country, then that playing field isn't going to level out.
And I think there's a sense in which we have to be careful sort of not to get caught up in our own hype or to just rely on our own social networks. I mean, like most journalists, I am utterly obsessed with Twitter. You know, if I wasn't up on this stage and if I had a cell phone connection in this room, I'd be swiping it right now. But Twitter is totally unrepresentative. You know, during the James Comey hearing, you could get the sense like, wow, everyone's paying attention to the James Comey hearing. And wow, it had, you know, big TV ratings. But you know, maybe 15 million people watched on TV. Now that's a lot. That's like an NBA Finals game. But there's 320 million people in the country, and most of them aren't on Twitter. Or another thing is just thinking about how representative are your family members or are your friends? So, you know, we've done a little hand raising in the room. How many people here would say that their #1 best friend does not have a college degree? Raise your hand. And you know, there's a fair number of hands, but 70% of the country doesn't have a college degree. So if our social networks were really representative, there would be a lot more hands. And I don't know if anyone on this stage would have raised their hand to that question. So when you think about, you know, how in touch am I with the country as a whole, I think there's a lot more room for humility. There's a lot more space to just say, I don't know, I'm not in touch with everyone. And so when you try to make predictions about what's going to happen in 2018, don't think about your friends, your neighbors, your social networks, because it's really no longer the case that there's just a mainstream culture that everyone's tuned into.
So we've seen a lot of things happening. You had mentioned earlier about becoming the news, the media becoming the news, and we saw what occurred with Jorge Ramos. We see the open warfare with the White House and CNN. We saw a congressional candidate body slam a reporter. As we're going into 2018, do you think that journalists became the news in the lead up to 2016?
In some ways.
How so?
We were accused at Univision anyways, of being too left-leaning. We were very scrutinized on the way we were covering the elections. Whereas, you know, we were out there, we were being critical, and critical sometimes, critical is not biased. Many people perceived us as biased because we were being too critical. But like you guys mentioned before, we were as critical of the Obama administration and of administrations past, yet they decided that we had taken a stance and that we were pursuing a certain line of journalism, where us on the ground were not. We were trying to get the stories fair, factual, and unbiased as possible. And I think the mainstream media on the other side saw us as a Clinton spokesperson in a way that was not representative or fair to Univision, and I'm just speaking solely here on Univision. But yeah, we became the news in that sense, in many ways.
Every time somebody asks me that question, I think of the reporters who've been killed in Mexico, or imprisoned in Venezuela, or kicked out of Venezuela, and I think it's not nearly as bad. And I'm confident that the public institutions in this country and public opinion will not permit it to get that bad. And so there's that. We start with that. We've been part of the story before. In the 70s, Nixon and Spiro Agnew certainly tried to make us the issue. Trump, as somebody who is an expert in mass media and mass media consumption, did it to great effect. Bernie Sanders did it too, accusing all of us of being one-sided during the Democratic primary. Again, I repeat to you what my boss said. We're not at war with the administration. We're not at war with any political party. We're just doing our job. And look at our new motto: democracy dies in darkness. Democracia muere en la oscuridad.
La oscuridad.
And that's our principle. So you know, we will just keep doing our job, and you know, we appreciate that we are collectively in better shape, I think, than we have been in a long time. CNN is printing money right now because the ratings are so good. You know, we just had 1 billion page views last month, which was the highest we'd ever had at the Washington Post. You guys are thriving, especially in the digital space.
We have the most news hours we've ever had
Right.
in our history at Univision.
And print was on its way out.
And
that's
it's
what
not
they've been. But I remember, I was thinking of a story Janet was mentioning when she got the question at the first briefing, and the article came out on why Univision now instead of Fox. That happened during the Obama administration. And when the press briefing occasionally gave a question to a Spanish language outlet, then the article by one of the colleagues of Ed was, well, this was a distraction. It was to change the subject. We weren't taken seriously, so it's not new. I think the challenge that we face, and I think it's a good moment of reflection for journalists, is our job to give you information, to give the public information. I think sometimes we assume that we know what we want to tell you, and we know what you want, and we know what you think. And I think we just have to step back a little, give the information, not assume. Sometimes I can understand if you watch my network all day, or if you watch CNN all day, you'll hear the same story, and it probably gets repetitive, and maybe you don't want to watch it. But the ratings are proving that there is an interest. So, as Ed said, you have a choice, viewers have a choice, and maybe we have to find a way to understand that we provide information, but whatever happens with it is what you decide to do with it, and not underestimate the capacity and the ability of the readership and the viewership to understand. Maybe that's why there's this disconnect, because people are not seeing what they want, or they are, but they get enough of it, so they just do something else in life. And I think, at least personally, that's something I think about when I'm filing a story. I don't want to spoon feed people because I don't want to insult them. So I'll tell the stories, I'll let other colleagues tell the story, and that's a question I ask myself constantly. How can I do it so that people feel informed and don't feel like they're being thrust upon the information? It might be a debate that we as journalists have to make.
So what do you all see are the major challenges for the future of media? What happens in the future, and where is the industry going?
I think fake news is the way of, it's going to be the vein of our existence for a long time. Trying to fact check everything, it's become a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge, but it's a job that's necessary, needs to be done, and it's going to be part of, we've always had to fact check. That's just never, that's always been part of the job. But I think with the variety, so to say, of fake information out there, it makes our job a lot harder, and it makes us more accountable to what we put on and how we put it and how we portray the news and how we just, we tell the story. And I think that continues to be and will continue to be a challenge, because people are picking and choosing what they want to hear and how they want to hear it and what information they want to consume. And it may not all be truthful, and it may not all be accurate. So we as journalists have to do an extra good of a job at discerning what it is and what it's not, and holding people accountable, holding the president accountable. I mean, we have to go through part of my day consists of going through his Twitter feed and fact-checking tweets and not letting him say to the nation whatever it is that comes to his mind without being held accountable. And I think that's just going to continue to be that way.
I just hope that for every 2 or 3 reporters who are following the president's tweets and fact-checking that we'll have reporters who are doing that for governors, for congressmen, for state representatives, for city councilmen, for mayors. We love that you're all reading us and the New York Times and Politico a lot more than you used to, but please also read and cultivate and support your local news sources, whether that's a website or a radio station or a newspaper that is still struggling. Local journalism, I think, is at real risk now as this bubble continues to expand or the industry heads to the bigger cities. And so we just have to, we as an industry have to be mindful of that, but you as consumers also need to help support them, because as I said, democracy dies in darkness. That's not just in Washington, that's in Austin, that's in Sacramento, that's in Phoenix and everywhere else. The other thing I'm just curious to watch for, and I think it's relevant to this group, and I don't want to put you two on the spot, is what does happen to Spanish language media as those that speak Spanish first or primarily get older and become a smaller part of the news audience. Do we eventually see a Spanglish news network? I would love to watch that. And I think ESPN is experimenting with this a little bit. They have a show that airs in Spanglish. There are websites and videos that do a lot of this, and I think that may be the next sort of area of innovation to some extent. You guys especially do a lot of work that's digitally focused for younger folks and is
and
a
it's
little
in
bit
English.
in yeah.
Well, we do publish op-eds in English.
Yeah.
We do have a website in English, completely in English, that we publish. We don't translate. We do original stories in English as well. Our digital newscast that airs now at noon has a lot of, I would say, a little bit of Spanglish. It's a lot more relaxed, and so it's a way of the future.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of that in radio as well.
Yeah.
No.
I think the future, the question of the future, where I see it, I'm an optimist. I think it's a very positive future. And the fact that Latinos are such a key demographic, that this segment of the population is so young and is having kids and working and will have a very, very important impact in the future of the nation. And I think the fact that we are also such high consumers of digital technology, of smartphones, that puts us in a position to empezar a hablar en Spanglish para ver si encontramos trabajo en el futuro. But I think we have a very bright path ahead of us, because the work that we're doing right now, the work that, it's amazing, if you watch the Washington Post, in a week they could have 3 or 4 different exclusive stories, and that's just the strength of shining light on darkness. And the New York Times does it, and CNN does it, and sometimes they'll make mistakes or will make mistakes. But I think it's good for democracy that we have a space where journalism thrives, where power might not like it, and it's not only the president who gets upset with reporting. Other officials at different levels don't like reporting. But as Ed said, we're not in a situation like our colleagues are in other countries where reporting can cost them their life. So I'm an optimist. I think that things look good, that the amount of kids, of Latinos who are coming through the colleges, who are studying journalism, who are English dominant, but who have a different perspective on issues, will definitely have an impact. And we talk about the lack of representation, of the lack of reporters. I know for a fact that CNN on the domestic side is doing a lot, and you see more and more faces every day. And it's not only going to be the faces on camera, it's going to be the people behind the cameras making the decisions, because they are the ones who are able to relate to things that you and this audience understand, that to us is normal, that to us it's normal, and it's having our cousins, our tias, our tios. You can be from Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, from wherever, and to us, family is normal. And sometimes our non-Latino friends might not understand our family dynamics, but I think that's going to come more and more into the mix. I was always surprised with Friends. It had huge success, and I always thought, this is a show that happens in New York, and these friends don't have any Latino friends. That, I don't get it. So I think that's where it's going to change, and we're just going to be part of the fabric, and we have the potential.
You mean Courtney Cox wasn't a Latina?
Huh?
Courtney Cox wasn't a Latina in that
No.
film? No?
Tucker? So we've been talking a lot about age, and I sort of want to circle back. We were talking earlier about how Latino coverage is not just immigration, and maybe the healthcare bill, for example, is something where you can think about in that context. The most common age for a white American is 57 years old. The most common age for a Hispanic American is 10 years old. So if you're writing a story about the health bill, and you're deciding, how much of this page should I devote to the effect it's going to have on retirees, or the effect it's going to have on families with children, whether you know it or not, you're making a decision about race in your coverage, or ethnicity in your coverage. So I think that's going to be continue to be a big divide between Latino media specifically, and I guess the rest of the media, as you might call it. Now, you said you're an optimist. I'm a pessimist with a lot of this stuff. People with the media bubble, they ask me, okay, what's the fix? Do we just pass some tax credits from newspapers, or do we start some mass movement of all subscribing to local papers? I don't think that's gonna fix it. I don't think that's gonna save it. I think that the trends with online media thriving in cities and newspapers around the country struggling, I think that's going to continue. I think it's going to become more extreme. And so I think it's less helpful to think about, how can you reverse these ginormous economic forces shaping the industry, and it's more, how do you recognize it? How do you mitigate it? How do you respond to it? And I think in 2018, and especially when Donald Trump comes back up for re-election in 2020, assuming nothing happens before then, I think it's going to be, if you can believe it, a more bubbled media than we see now, and a bigger divide than we see now. And I think that's something we need to prepare for.
I just want to clarify, because this is interesting. You say the most common age among white people is 57?
Yeah.
So among white people, there are more 57-year-olds than there are 55-year-olds?
Yes.
Okay, so among Latinos, there are more 10-year-olds than
any other
28-year-olds?
Right,
Okay.
correct.
Well, we've seen how the media has a significant impact, it had a significant impact in the 2016 election, and as the 2018 election season is quickly upon us, we're going to really observe with interest on how the media's reporting will shape American and Latinos, specifically faith in the integrity of the media and our nation's political system. We've had a wonderful panel. Let's give them a great round of applause. With that, we have a couple of housekeeping items. I want to remind participants to take their items to the, as you exit the room. Lunch will begin promptly, and we encourage attendees to take the opportunity to visit the exhibitors and enjoy the photo booth and go to the conference app to answer any questions that you have and to participate in the poll. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.